The woman stepped off the stagecoach into the dusty main street of Wallace, Idaho, and announced to anyone within earshot that God Almighty had sent her here to find a husband, which made the miners lounging outside the saloon burst into laughter so loud it echoed off the mountains surrounding the town. It was July of 1878, and Caroline Sullivan had traveled all the way from Philadelphia with nothing but 2 carpetbags, her mother's Bible, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord had spoken to her in a dream 3 months prior. The dream had been so vivid she could still recall every detail: mountains covered in pine trees, a wooden sign that read Wallace, and a voice telling her that her future awaited in the wilderness of the Idaho Territory. Her father had called her foolish, her sisters had wept and begged her to stay, but Caroline had saved every penny from her work as a seamstress, and when she had enough for passage west, she left without looking back. Now, standing in the middle of this rough frontier town with mud-caked streets and buildings that looked like they might blow over in a strong wind, she wondered if perhaps her family had been right to question her sanity. The men who laughed at her proclamation were rough-looking creatures with scraggly beards and clothes that probably had not been washed in months. Women peeked out from shop windows with expressions that ranged from pity to amusement. "God sent you here," one of the miners called out, slapping his knee. "Well, he must have a sense of humor, lady. Ain't nothing here but rocks and trees and men too ornery for civilized society." Caroline lifted her chin and straightened her travel-worn dress. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said firmly, "and I trust his guidance more than the mockery of strangers." This only made them laugh harder. She felt heat rising in her cheeks, but refused to let them see her falter. Instead, she picked up her bags and walked toward what appeared to be a boarding house, her boots squelching in the mud. Behind her, she could hear the men still chuckling and making jokes about desperate women and divine intervention. The boarding house was run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Porter, who looked Caroline up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of foolish dreamers come through her doors. "You got money?" she asked bluntly. "I have enough for 2 weeks," Caroline replied. "I plan to find employment." Mrs. Porter's expression softened slightly. "You got more gumption than sense, girl, but I suppose that describes half the people in this territory. Rooms upstairs, second door on the left, suppers at 6. You miss it, you go hungry until breakfast." The room was small and sparse, containing nothing but a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the street. Caroline set down her bags and sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what she had done. She was hundreds of miles from everything she had ever known, in a town where she knew no one, based on nothing more substantial than a dream. She pulled out her mother's Bible and held it close to her chest. Her mother had died when Caroline was 16, taken by the fever that swept through Philadelphia that terrible winter. Before she passed, she had pressed this Bible into Caroline's hands and told her to always trust in the Lord's plan, even when it made no earthly sense. "I'm trusting you," Caroline whispered into the empty room. "Please don't let me have made a terrible mistake." That evening at supper, she met the other boarders, a couple of miners, a clerk from the general store, and a widow woman who said very little but watched everyone with sharp eyes. The conversation centered on the new silver strike up in the mountains and speculation about how long the boom would last. "You looking for a husband, then?" the widow woman asked Caroline suddenly, causing everyone else at the table to fall silent. Caroline felt all eyes turned to her. "I believe God has a plan for my life," she said carefully, "and that plan led me here." One of the miners snorted. "Well, there's plenty of men hereabouts looking for wives, that's for certain. But most of them ain't the sort you'd want to hitch yourself to. Present company excluded, of course," he added with a gap-toothed grin. "Don't listen to him," the clerk said. "There's some good men in Wallace. You just got to be careful. A lot of drifters and rough types, too." Over the next few days, Caroline began to explore the town and look for work. Wallace was bigger than it had first appeared, with several streets of shops and businesses catering to the miners who worked the claims in the surrounding mountains. She found employment at the general store, helping the owner's wife with inventory and serving customers. The pay was modest, but enough to cover her room and board with a little left over. The work was harder than sewing had been, requiring her to lift heavy boxes and spend long hours on her feet, but Caroline threw herself into it with determination. She attended church on Sunday, a small wooden building where the minister preached about perseverance and faith to a congregation that looked like it needed both. Several men approached her after the service, awkwardly introducing themselves and making it clear they were interested in courtship. There was Thomas, a banker's assistant with soft hands and a nervous laugh. There was James, a miner who spoke earnestly about his claim and his plans to strike it rich. There was William, who owned a small ranch outside town and needed a wife to help manage his household. All of them were perfectly respectable, and Caroline tried to imagine building a life with each of them. But every time she prayed about it, she felt nothing but a quiet certainty that none of these men were the reason God had brought her to Wallace. Weeks passed, and the initial mockery she had faced began to fade into general acceptance. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing her at the general store or walking to church on Sunday mornings. Some of the women even began to warm to her, inviting her to a quilting circle where they gathered weekly to sew and gossip. It was at the quilting circle that she first heard about Coleman Reid. "Lives up in the mountains like a hermit," one of the women said, her needle flashing through the fabric. "Comes into town maybe once a month for supplies. Built himself a cabin up near Bear Creek, so they say." "I heard he was a trapper," another woman added. "Sells furs and game. Keeps to himself mostly." "He's certainly got the look of a wild man," Mrs. Porter said with a sniff. "All that long hair and those buckskins. Barely says 2 words when he comes into town." Caroline felt something stir in her chest, a flutter of intuition she could not explain. "Why does he live alone in the mountains?" she asked. The women exchanged glances. "No one knows for sure," the first woman said. "Some say he's running from something. Others say he just prefers solitude. He's been up there for near about 3 years now. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, from what I hear." "And about as sociable," Mrs. Porter added dryly. Caroline said nothing more, but that night she prayed specifically about Coleman Reid, the mountain man she had never met. She asked God if this was the reason she'd been led to Wallace, and she waited for an answer. It came 2 weeks later on a crisp October morning when Coleman Reid walked into the general store. Caroline was reorganizing the canned goods when the door opened, letting in a gust of cold air and the biggest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorway. His hair was dark and fell past his shoulders, and he wore buckskin clothing that emphasized the powerful muscles of his arms and chest. His face was weathered from sun and wind, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of winter sky. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He nodded to Mr. Henderson, the store owner, and began gathering supplies with economical movements, selecting items with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what he needed. Caroline found herself staring and quickly looked away, her heart beating faster than it should. Mr. Henderson greeted him warmly enough. "Good to see you, Coleman. How's the trapping?" "Fair enough," Coleman replied. His voice was deep and resonant, with a roughness that suggested he did not use it often. "Winter's coming early this year. Can feel it in the air. Need me to add anything special to your usual order?" "Just the basics: coffee, flour, salt, ammunition." Caroline busied herself with straightening items that were already straight, acutely aware of his presence. She had never been the sort of girl who lost her head over a handsome face, but there was something about this man that made her pulse race. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with the grace of a predator despite his size. Perhaps it was the sense of self-sufficiency that radiated from him like heat from a fire. She was so distracted that she knocked over a display of tin cups, sending them clattering across the floor. She gasped and immediately dropped to her knees to gather them up, mortified by her clumsiness. "Let me help you with that." The deep voice came from right beside her, and she looked up to find Coleman kneeling next to her, his large hands collecting the scattered cups with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she managed to say, acutely aware of how close he was. Up close, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair and the small scar above his left eyebrow. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard and did not shy from difficulty. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same cup, and Caroline felt a jolt of electricity run through her. His winter blue eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them kneeling on the wooden floor of the general store. "I'm usually not so clumsy," she said, trying to break the spell. "Accidents happen," he said simply. He gathered the last few cups and stood, offering her his hand to help her up. His hand was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. "Thank you, Mr. Reid. Coleman Reid. Mr. Reid, I am Caroline Sullivan." He studied her face for a long moment, and she had the strangest feeling he was seeing more than she intended to show. "You are new to Wallace," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived in July from Philadelphia. That's a long way to travel." "I felt called to come here," she said, then immediately regretted it. She had no idea why she was telling this stranger about her divine guidance when it had only brought her mockery from everyone else. But Coleman simply nodded as though this made perfect sense. Sometimes a person knows they need to be somewhere, even if they cannot explain why. He said it so matter-of-factly that Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. After months of being laughed at or looked at with pity, here was someone who simply accepted her truth without judgment. "Yes," she whispered, "exactly that." Mr. Henderson called from the counter that Coleman's order was ready. Coleman touched the brim of his hat to Caroline in a gesture of farewell and went to collect his supplies. She watched as he loaded everything into a large pack that he shouldered with ease, paid Mr. Henderson, and walked out the door without looking back. Caroline stood there for a long moment after he left, her hand still tingling from where he had held it. That night, she could not sleep. She kept seeing those winter blue eyes and hearing that deep, calm voice. She prayed for guidance and clarity, but for the first time since arriving in Wallace, she received no clear answer, only a sense of waiting, of something unfolding in its own time. Over the next weeks, she asked subtle questions about Coleman Reid. What she learned painted a picture of a man who valued solitude but was respected by those who knew him. He was fair in his dealings, kept his word, and had once carried a miner with a broken leg down from the mountains on his back, walking for miles to get him to the doctor. He did not drink to excess or cause trouble. He simply lived his life on his own terms, away from the complications of town society. "Why did he come to Wallace?" Caroline asked Mrs. Porter one evening. The older woman shrugged. "No one knows for certain. He showed up about 3 years back, bought supplies, and headed into the mountains. Built himself a cabin and has been there ever since. Some say he was a soldier during the war, but he doesn't talk about his past." Caroline did the arithmetic in her head. The war had ended 13 years ago, which meant Coleman would have been young when he served, probably not much older than she was now. What had he experienced that made him seek solitude in the wilderness? November brought snow to the mountains, dusting them white like sugar on cake. Caroline had purchased warmer clothes and was learning to navigate the mud and slush that characterized Wallace's streets in winter. She had settled into a routine: work at the general store, church on Sundays, quilting circle on Wednesday evenings. Several men continued to court her with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but she politely discouraged them all. She could not explain it, but she was waiting for something, and none of these men were it. The second time Coleman came to town, it was a gray December morning with snow falling in lazy spirals. Caroline saw him through the window before he entered the store, his broad form moving through the snow like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Her heart started that same rapid beating, and she smoothed her hair and checked to make sure her apron was straight. He came through the door in a swirl of snowflakes, stamping his boots on the mat. His cheeks were reddened from the cold, and his breath misted in the air. He wore a heavy coat made of bearskin that made him look even more massive than before. "Morning, Coleman," Mr. Henderson called. "Cold enough for you?" "It will get colder," Coleman replied. "This is nothing yet." He began his usual rounds of the store, and Caroline busied herself with tasks that just happened to keep her in his general vicinity. She was rearranging the fabric bolts when he approached, looking at the selection of wool cloth. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, proud that her voice came out steady. "I need cloth for patching," he said, "something sturdy that will hold up to rough use." She selected a heavy wool in dark gray. "This should work well. It is quite durable." "How much do I need for patching 2 shirts and a pair of trousers?" She calculated quickly. 2 yards should be sufficient if you are economical with your cuts. He nodded and took the cloth she measured out. "Thank you, Miss Sullivan." She was absurdly pleased that he remembered her name. "You are welcome. Do you do your own mending, Mr. Reid?" "I do everything myself," he said simply. "No choice when you live alone in the mountains." "That must be difficult," she said softly. He looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes. Difficult and simple are not the same thing. My life is simple. That suits me. But do you not get lonely? The question came out before she could stop it, far too personal for casual conversation. She expected him to close down, to give her some curt response and walk away. Instead, he considered the question seriously. Sometimes, he admitted, but I have been lonelier in crowds than I ever have been in the mountains. At least the silence there is honest. Carolyn understood exactly what he meant. She had felt that same loneliness in Philadelphia, surrounded by family and friends who loved her, but never truly understood the restlessness in her soul, the sense that she was meant for something different than the life they envisioned for her. I think I understand that, she said quietly. He studied her face again with that intense focus that made her feel like he could see straight through to her heart. I think maybe you do, he said finally. Mr. Henderson called out a question about ammunition, breaking the moment. Coleman nodded to Caroline and went to discuss his order. But before he left the store, he paused at the door and looked back at her. You take care, Miss Sullivan. Winter in the mountains can be harsh. You as well, Mr. Reid. After he left, Caroline found herself smiling for no particular reason, and when Mrs. Henderson commented on her cheerful mood, she could not explain it in any way that would make sense. Christmas came and went quietly. The town put up decorations, and the church held a special service. Caroline received letters from her sisters begging her to come home, saying that surely she had learned by now that her dream had been just that, a dream. But Caroline had no intention of leaving. Whatever she was meant to find in Wallace, she had not found it yet, though she was beginning to have a strong suspicion about what, or rather who, it might be. January brought brutal cold and snowstorms that sometimes kept people indoors for days. The third time Coleman came to town, it was after one such storm, and he looked more rugged than ever, with ice crystals clinging to his beard and his face reddened from exposure. Caroline was alone in the store that day, as Mr. Henderson had gone to check on a delivery, and his wife was home with a cold. She heard the door and looked up to see Coleman brushing snow from his coat. Mr. Reid, you should not be traveling in this weather, she said, genuinely concerned. What if you got caught in another storm? I know these mountains, he said. I can read the weather well enough to stay safe, but I appreciate your concern. He moved through the store with his usual efficiency, but Caroline noticed he was favoring his left side slightly. Are you hurt? She asked. Just a bruise. Had a disagreement with a tree that fell in the last storm. The tree won. Let me see. He looked surprised. It is nothing. Please, I have some medical training. My mother was a nurse, and she taught me how to care for injuries. He hesitated, then shrugged out of his heavy coat. Even through his shirt, she could see the powerful muscles of his shoulders and chest. He unbuttoned the shirt enough to reveal his left side, where an enormous bruise spread across his ribs in shades of purple and black. Caroline gasped. Mr. Reid, this is not nothing. You could have broken ribs. They are not broken. I have had broken ribs before. I know what they feel like. She pressed gently around the bruised area, and he winced slightly, but did not pull away. You are fortunate, but you need to wrap this to provide support and reduce further injury. Wait here. She went to the back room where they kept medical supplies and returned with bandages and liniment. This will help with the pain and swelling. Take off your shirt. He raised an eyebrow, but did as she asked. Caroline tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but it was difficult when faced with the sheer masculine beauty of him. His chest and arms were sculpted with muscles earned through hard labor, his skin marked with various scars that told stories of a life lived dangerously. She warmed the liniment between her hands and applied it gently to the bruised area, trying not to notice how his muscles tensed under her touch. How did you learn to do this? He asked, his voice rougher than usual. My mother, as I said. She believed women should know how to care for injuries and illnesses, especially in places where doctors are scarce. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. I miss her every day. Caroline wrapped his ribs with practiced efficiency, trying to ignore how intimate this felt, her hands moving over his warm skin. When she finished, he put his shirt back on slowly, watching her face. Thank you, he said quietly. That was kind of you. Anyone would have done the same. No, he said firmly. Not everyone would have noticed I was hurt, and fewer still would have taken the time to help. They stood there in the quiet store, snow falling softly outside the windows, and Caroline felt the air between them change, becoming charged with something unspoken but powerful. "Why did you really come to Wallace, Carolyn?" he asked, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice made her shiver. She could have given him the polite answer she gave everyone else, but something in his eyes told her he wanted the truth. "I had a dream," she said. "God spoke to me and told me my future was here. I know it sounds foolish. Everyone laughed when I told them." "I'm not laughing." "No," she agreed. "You are not. Why is that?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I understand about being called to a place. I came to these mountains because I could not breathe anywhere else. After the war, I tried to go back to regular life, tried to pretend I was the same person I had been before. But the war changes a man. I saw things, did things that marked me in ways that will never heal. In the mountains, I found peace. Not happiness maybe, but peace. I stopped pretending to be something I was not." "What did you do before the war?" Carolyn asked gently. "I was a farmer's son in Missouri, had a simple life planned, marry a local girl, work the land, raise children. Then the war came, and that boy died somewhere on a battlefield. The man who came back did not fit in that life anymore." Carolyn's heart ached for him. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of memories he carried. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his. "You did what you had to do to survive. That does not make you less worthy of peace or happiness." His hand turned under hers, his fingers threading through hers, and the connection between them was suddenly electric. "Why do I feel like I can tell you things I have never told another soul?" he asked, almost to himself. "Maybe because God brought me here for you," Caroline whispered. The words hung in the air between them. Coleman's eyes widened slightly, and then his other hand came up to cup her cheek with surprising tenderness. "Do you really believe that?" "I do not know what else to believe. From the moment I saw you, I felt something I have never felt before, like recognition, like coming home." "I felt it too," he admitted. "Tried to tell myself it was foolishness. I have nothing to offer a woman like you. I live in a cabin in the mountains with no luxuries, no society, nothing but hard work and solitude." "What if that is exactly what I want?" Caroline asked, her heart pounding. "What if I am tired of society and its rules? What if I want a simple life with someone who understands that peace is more valuable than comfort?" He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. "You do not know what you are saying. You have not experienced a winter in the mountains, the isolation, the hardship." "Then show me." She said boldly. "Take me there. Let me see your world." "Caroline," his voice was strained, "if I take you to my cabin unchaperoned, your reputation will be ruined. Only if people know about it. And frankly, I care less about my reputation than I do about understanding whether what I feel for you is real or just romantic foolishness." He looked torn, desire and duty warring in his expression. "I could not live with myself if I damaged you." "You would damage me more by walking away when we both feel this connection," she said fiercely. "I did not travel across the country based on a dream only to let fear stop me from reaching for what God put in my path." Coleman released a long breath. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met. Is that a yes?" He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his whole face and made him look years younger. "It is a yes, but we do it properly. I will speak to Mrs. Porter about you taking a few days to visit the cabin. You can bring her as chaperone if that makes it more respectable." Caroline laughed at the thought of stern Mrs. Porter tramping through the snow to act as chaperone. "That will not be necessary. I trust you, Coleman." "Then you are either very wise or very foolish, and I am not sure which." "Perhaps both," she said with a smile. They made plans for him to collect her the following Sunday after church. Caroline spent the intervening days in a state of nervous excitement, praying constantly that she was not making a terrible mistake. But every time she prayed, she felt only peace and a certainty that this was right. Mrs. Porter was skeptical when Caroline told her she was going to visit Coleman's cabin. "That man is a hermit, girl. You will find nothing up there but cold and discomfort." "Perhaps," Caroline said, "but I need to see it for myself." "And if he tries to take advantage of you?" "He will not. He is a gentleman, despite his rough exterior." Mrs. Porter sniffed but did not forbid it. Caroline was an adult after all, and could make her own choices, however unwise they might be. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Caroline dressed in her warmest clothes and packed a small bag. After church, she found Coleman waiting outside with a horse laden with supplies and a smaller horse that he said was for her. "I borrowed her from a rancher friend," he explained. "She is gentle and sure-footed." The ride into the mountains was long and challenging. The trail was narrow and sometimes steep, winding through forests of pine and aspen. Coleman led the way with easy confidence, pointing out landmarks and warning her of treacherous spots. Caroline was not an experienced rider, but she managed to keep her seat and follow his guidance. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. Snow lay deep in places, and she could see the tracks of animals crossing the trail. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of hooves in snow and the occasional call of a bird. After several hours, they emerged into a clearing where a sturdy log cabin sat nestled against the mountainside. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting Coleman had left a fire banked before he descended to town. Behind the cabin, she could see a small barn and what looked like a smokehouse. "This is your home?" Caroline asked, awed by the beauty of the setting. Mountains rose all around them, their peaks white against the blue sky. The clearing offered a view that stretched for miles across valleys and ridges. "This is it," Coleman said, swinging down from his horse. He came to help her dismount, his strong hands spanning her waist and lifting her down as though she weighed nothing. For a moment, he held her there, her feet barely touching the ground, their faces close together. Then, he set her carefully down and stepped back. The inside of the cabin was simple but well made. One large room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a sleeping loft above reached by a ladder. The furniture was rough but sturdy, clearly made by Coleman's own hands. Furs covered the floor and the bed in the loft, providing warmth and comfort. Everything was neat and organized, surprising Caroline with its cleanliness. "I know it is not what you are accustomed to," Coleman said, watching her reaction carefully. "It is perfect," Caroline said honestly. "I can feel the care you have put into it. This is a home, not just a shelter." He visibly relaxed. "I will start a fire and make something warm to drink. You must be cold from the ride." While he worked, Caroline explored the cabin, touching things gently. She found his few books, a Bible, a volume of poetry, and a technical manual on trapping and hunting. She saw the careful repairs he had made to his clothes, the stitches small and even despite his large hands. She noticed the herbs hanging from the rafters, the organized shelves of preserved food, the tools maintained with obvious care. This was the home of a man who valued self-sufficiency and simplicity, but who was not without education or refinement. She could imagine herself here, could picture adding her own touches to this space, making it theirs instead of just his. They spent the afternoon talking, really talking, in a way Caroline had never talked with anyone before. Coleman spoke of his childhood in Missouri, of loving parents who died of cholera before the war. He spoke carefully of the war itself, not dwelling on the horrors but acknowledging how it had changed him. He talked about finding this place and building the cabin with his own hands, every log cut and placed with purpose. Caroline spoke of Philadelphia, of her life as a seamstress, of her mother's death and the emptiness she had felt afterward. She described her family's reaction to her decision to come west, the mockery she had faced, and the steady certainty that had sustained her. "Were you never afraid you were wrong?" Coleman asked. "That your dream was just a dream and nothing more?" "Of course I was afraid," Caroline admitted, "but more than fear, I felt conviction. I knew I could not live the rest of my life wondering what if. Even if I had come here and found nothing, at least I would have had the courage to try." "You are braver than any soldier I knew," Coleman said quietly. "I am not brave. I am just following where God leads. That is what bravery is, doing what you know is right even when you are afraid." As evening fell, Coleman prepared a simple meal of venison stew and fresh bread he had baked that morning. They ate by firelight, the intimacy of the setting not lost on either of them. After dinner, Caroline washed the dishes while Coleman brought in more wood for the fire. "Where will I sleep?" Caroline asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "You take the loft. I will sleep down here by the fire." "Coleman, I cannot take your bed." "You can, and you will. I have slept in far worse places than a warm floor by a fire." She wanted to argue, but could see from his expression that it would do no good. This was part of who he was, this protective instinct, this determination to care for others even at cost to himself. That night, lying in his bed surrounded by the scent of pine and something uniquely him, Carolyn stared up at the rough wooden ceiling and knew with absolute certainty that she loved this man. It was too fast, too sudden, too impossible, and yet utterly true. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his solitude and his hidden yearning for connection. She loved the life he had built here and wanted to be part of it. The question was whether he felt the same way. She got her answer the next morning. She woke to find Coleman already up, making coffee and preparing breakfast. When she climbed down from the loft, he looked up at her with an expression so tender it took her breath away. "I have been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what you said, about God sending you here." Caroline's heart started to pound. "And?" "I stopped believing in God during the war, saw too much death, too much suffering, could not reconcile a loving God with the things I witnessed. But last night, lying here looking up at you in my bed, safe and peaceful, I found myself praying for the first time in years, thanking him for bringing you to me, asking him if I could dare to hope that you were meant to be mine." Tears filled Caroline's eyes. "What did he say?" Coleman crossed the room to her, his movements deliberate but not rushed. He took her hands in his, those large, scarred hands that could fell trees and skin game, but held her with such care. "He reminded me that I am his answer. You said God sent you here to find a husband, and everyone mocked you. But I believe God sent you to me and sent me to you. I am his answer to your prayer, and you are his answer to a prayer I did not even know I was praying." "Coleman," she whispered, his name a prayer on her lips. I love you, Caroline Sullivan. I know it is too soon, and I know I have little to offer you but a hard life in these mountains. But I love you with everything I am, and if you will have me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret following that dream that brought you to Wallace." "I love you too," Caroline said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I have loved you since the moment you helped me pick up those cups in the general store. I would be honored to be your wife, to share this life with you, to build a future here in these mountains." He pulled her into his arms, and she went gladly, her head fitting perfectly against his chest. She could hear his heart pounding as fast as her own. He tilted her face up with gentle fingers and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and hope and love too long denied. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Coleman rested his forehead against hers. "We should go back to town today and do this properly. Speak to the minister, post the banns, get married with witnesses and blessings." "How long does that take?" "Usually 3 weeks." Caroline groaned. "That's an eternity." He laughed, the sound rusty as though he was out of practice. "It will give you time to be certain, to make sure this is really what you want." "I'm already certain. Nevertheless, I will not have anyone saying I rushed you into something or took advantage of you. We do this right." They rode back to Wallace that afternoon, and if they held hands whenever the trail allowed it, there was no one to see and comment. When they reached town, Coleman went straight to Mrs. Porter's and formally asked permission to court Caroline, explaining that he intended to marry her as soon as the proprieties allowed. Porter looked at Caroline. "Is this what you want, girl?" "It is," Caroline said firmly. "Well then, I suppose God works in mysterious ways after all. You have my blessing for what it is worth." The next 3 weeks were the longest of Caroline's life. Coleman came to town every few days, always bringing small gifts, wildflowers preserved in honey, a fur muff he had made for her, a wooden hair comb he had carved with intricate designs. They spent every possible moment together, always properly chaperoned, learning each other's likes and dislikes, dreams and fears. Carolyn learned that Coleman loved poetry but was shy about admitting it, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, that he was unfailingly patient with children and animals, that he had nightmares sometimes but did not like to talk about them. Coleman learned that Caroline had a stubborn streak a mile wide, that she could not carry a tune but loved to sing anyway, that she was surprisingly strong and capable, not the delicate city girl he had first imagined, that she had a gift for seeing the best in people. They were married on a crisp February morning in 1879, with most of the town in attendance. Caroline wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, and Coleman had gotten a proper haircut and wore clothes that, while not fancy, were clean and new. The minister spoke about love and commitment, about being equally yoked, about trusting in God's plan. When Coleman slipped the gold ring onto her finger, his hands were steady despite his emotion. When Caroline promised to love and honor him all her days, her voice was clear and certain. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Coleman kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance sighed audibly. The townspeople had arranged a simple reception at the church with food and music. Caroline danced with her new husband, marveling at how gracefully he moved despite his size. She saw the way people looked at them, some with approval, some with skepticism, but she did not care. She had found what God sent her to Wallace to find, and nothing else mattered. As the sun began to set, Coleman leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Ready to go home, wife?" The word sent shivers down her spine. "Ready, husband." They rode into the mountains under a sky turning pink and gold with sunset. Coleman had loaded the pack horses with Caroline's belongings from the boarding house, everything she owned in the world now heading to her new home. The ride seemed shorter this time, perhaps because Caroline knew where they were going, or perhaps because joy made the miles pass quickly. When they arrived at the cabin, Coleman insisted on carrying her over the threshold, a tradition he claimed to have no patience for, but honored anyway. He set her down gently in the middle of their home, and Caroline looked around with new eyes. This was hers now, theirs, the beginning of their life together. That night, with snow falling softly outside and firelight dancing on the walls, Coleman made love to his wife with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. He was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what pleased her, whispering words of love and devotion against her skin. And when they finally lay tangled together in the loft, Caroline understood that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not just a husband, but a partner. Not just a home, but a haven. Not just love, but the kind of deep, abiding connection that most people only dreamed of. The winter passed in a blur of quiet happiness. Caroline adapted to life in the mountains with surprising ease. She learned to cook over the open fire, to preserve food, to mend and make clothes from furs and hides. Coleman taught her to read the weather, to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the forest. She taught him to open his heart again, to laugh freely, to believe that he deserved happiness. They developed routines and rhythms, the small intimacies of married life. Coleman would wake early and start the fire, then wake Caroline with coffee and kisses. They would work together on the daily tasks, splitting wood or tending the small garden plot Coleman had prepared for spring planting. In the evenings, they would read to each other or simply sit by the fire, content in each other's presence. Once a month, they would go to town for supplies and to attend church. The townspeople grew accustomed to seeing them together, and the initial skepticism faded into acceptance and even admiration. Coleman Reid had found himself a wife who could match him in determination and strength, and Caroline Reid had found the husband God promised her. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it brought an explosion of life. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the forest filled with birdsong. Caroline planted a garden with seeds she had brought from Philadelphia and others Coleman had traded for. She hummed as she worked, absurdly happy to be planting vegetables in the wilderness of Idaho. It was in May that she realized she was pregnant. At first, she thought her monthly courses were just late due to the change in her life and diet. But as the weeks passed and other signs appeared, she knew with growing certainty that she was carrying Coleman's child. She was nervous about telling him, worried about how he would react to the news. They had never discussed children, though she assumed he wanted them. One evening after supper, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. He looked at her with concern. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "Not ill. Expecting." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "A baby? You are carrying our baby?" She nodded, searching his face for his reaction. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming it with joy. "We're going to have a child," he said, wonder in his voice. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. Thank you. I have not done anything yet but get pregnant, she said with a laugh. You have given me everything, Coleman said fiercely. A reason to believe in God again, a reason to hope, a future, and now a child. I will never be able to repay you. You do not need to repay me. Loving me is enough. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. Coleman became even more protective than usual, if such a thing were possible. He insisted Caroline rest more, worried constantly about her health, and began making plans for their growing family. He built a proper cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving protective symbols into the wood. He made sure their stores were well stocked, planning ahead for when Caroline would be recovering from childbirth. Summer passed in a golden haze. Caroline's belly swelled with their child, and she felt healthy and strong despite occasional nausea in the mornings. Coleman would talk to the baby through her stomach, telling stories and making promises about the life they would give their child. Caroline would watch him with her heart so full she thought it might burst. In late August, they made the journey to town so Caroline could be examined by the doctor. He pronounced her healthy and estimated the baby would arrive in early December. Mrs. Porter immediately began organizing the women of Wallace to prepare for the birth, insisting that Caroline should come to town a month early to stay at the boarding house. Mountain winters are unpredictable, she said firmly. What if you go into labor during a blizzard and Coleman cannot get you help? But Caroline was adamant. I am having this baby in our home, with my husband beside me. We will manage. Coleman supported her decision, though she could see the worry in his eyes. I've helped with difficult animal births, he said, and Caroline has medical training from her mother. We will be prepared. The doctor gave them instructions and supplies, making them promise to send for him if there were any complications. They returned to the cabin, laden with baby clothes donated by the women of Wallace, blankets, and supplies. Autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Caroline spent her days preparing for the baby's arrival, washing tiny clothes and organizing supplies. Coleman split wood until they had enough to last through 2 winters, determined that his wife and child would never be cold. In late November, the first major snowstorm of the season hit. Coleman kept the fire roaring and made sure Caroline stayed warm and comfortable. She was huge now, her belly making it difficult to move easily. She felt ungainly and awkward, but Coleman looked at her with such adoration, she could almost believe she was beautiful. You are carrying our child, he would say when she complained about her size. That makes you the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. The baby came on a cold December night with snow falling heavy outside. Caroline's pains started in the afternoon, regular and strong. Coleman tried to hide his fear, but she could see it in the tension of his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as he helped her prepare. I'm going to be fine, she assured him. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. Not my woman, not my wife carrying my child. The labor was long and difficult. Caroline tried to be brave, but there were moments when the pain was so intense she cried out. Coleman held her hand, his face pale but determined, whispering encouragement and love. When she was too exhausted to continue, he held her upright, taking her weight, giving her his strength. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the cabin. Coleman caught him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he placed the squalling infant on Caroline's chest. A boy, he whispered in awe. We have a son. Caroline looked down at the tiny red face of her baby, at his perfect fingers and the dark hair plastered to his head, and fell instantly in love. Hello, little one, she murmured. We have been waiting for you. They named him Samuel, after Coleman's father. He was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs and an appetite that kept Caroline busy nursing. Coleman was utterly besotted, spending hours just watching his son sleep or helping Caroline change him or walking the floor when Samuel fussed. I never thought I would have this, Coleman confessed one night, holding his son against his bare chest while Caroline rested. A family. A real home. I thought I had lost my chance at this kind of happiness. God's timing is perfect, Caroline said softly. We both had to become who we needed to be before we could find each other. Winter deepened, but the cabin was warm and filled with love. Caroline adjusted to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything. Coleman proved to be an involved father, never considering baby care beneath him. He would get up in the night to bring Samuel to Caroline for feeding, would change diapers without complaint, would sing rough lullabies in his deep voice that somehow soothed the baby better than anything else. When spring came again, Samuel was crawling and getting into everything. Coleman baby proofed the cabin, moving anything dangerous out of reach. He built a fence around the garden to keep Samuel safe while Caroline worked. He carved toys for his son and taught him to laugh with silly faces in games. In June, they made the trip to town for supplies and church. The townspeople crowded around to see the baby, marveling at how he had grown. Samuel had Coleman's dark hair and Caroline's green eyes, a perfect blend of both parents. "Look at you," Mrs. Porter said, bouncing Samuel on her hip. "Never thought I would see the day Coleman Reid became a family man, but here you are, proof that miracles happen." "She says God sent her here to find a husband, and we all mocked her," one of the women said. "But she was right all along." "God sent her to me," Coleman said, pulling Caroline close. "I am God's answer to her prayer, and she is the answer to mine." Time passed in the gentle rhythm of seasons and years. Samuel grew from baby to toddler to little boy, strong and fearless like his father, but with his mother's compassionate heart. Caroline had 2 more children, a daughter named Grace and another son they called Joseph. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Coleman building additional rooms and a proper second floor. The children thrived in the mountains, learning to track and hunt from their father, to read and write and tend the sick from their mother. They grew up understanding the value of hard work and the beauty of simplicity. They knew they were loved beyond measure, that their parents had found each other against all odds and built a life of purpose and meaning. Carolyn never regretted her decision to follow that dream to Wallace. She had found exactly what God promised, a husband who cherished her, a home that filled her heart, a life that mattered. When people asked her how she had known Coleman was the one, she always said the same thing. "I prayed for guidance, and God sent me to Wallace. The townspeople mocked when I said I was there to find a husband, but Coleman simply said, 'I am God's answer.' And he was right. He was the answer to every prayer I had prayed, and many I had not yet thought to pray." Coleman, for his part, would simply pull her close and kiss her forehead, this man who had once believed himself too damaged for love, who had hidden in the mountains thinking he was meant for solitude. He had learned that God's plans were bigger than his pain, that healing came through connection, that love could reach even the most wounded heart. Their children grew and eventually married and had children of their own. Samuel became a rancher, settling on land near his parents' cabin. Grace married a doctor and moved to Boise, but visited often with her family. Joseph took over his father's trapping business, loving the mountains as much as Coleman did. Through it all, Caroline and Coleman remained deeply in love, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. They grew old together in the cabin he had built with his own hands, surrounded by children and grandchildren who filled the mountains with laughter. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Coleman took Caroline's hand and led her outside to watch the sunset, paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, the same view they had shared countless times over the years. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, as he sometimes did. "Leaving Philadelphia, giving up the chance for an easier life?" Caroline looked at the man beside her, his hair now more silver than dark, his face lined with years of laughter and hard work. She thought about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had built together, about the love that had sustained them through every challenge. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "God led me here to find you, and you were exactly what he promised, his perfect answer." Coleman smiled and pulled her close, this woman who had believed when others mocked, who had traveled across the country on nothing but faith, who had seen past his rough exterior to the heart beneath. "I love you, Coleman Reid," he said, the same words he had spoken thousands of times over the years, but that never lost their power. "I love you, Coleman Reid," she replied, "always and forever." They stood together as the sun set behind the mountains, 2 souls that had found each other against impossible odds, proof that sometimes dreams were more than just dreams, that faith was rewarded, and that God's answers often came in unexpected packages. The townspeople of Wallace had mocked when a young woman stepped off the stagecoach and announced God had sent her to find a husband, but the mountain man who said, "I am God's answer," had been absolutely right. Their love story became legend in Wallace, passed down through generations as proof that miracles still happened, that true love existed, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was trust in a dream and follow where it led. Caroline had followed her dream to the mountains of Idaho and found not just a husband but a partner, not just a home but a haven, not just love but a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the end, God had been faithful to his promise. He had led Caroline to exactly where she needed to be, to the man she was meant to love, to the life she was meant to live. And Coleman, who had thought himself beyond redemption, had discovered that he was worthy of love after all, that his damaged heart could heal, that his solitary life could become rich and full. Together, they proved that faith and love could overcome any obstacle, that God's timing was perfect even when it seemed impossibly slow, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple step of faith and a willingness to believe in the impossible. Their story was one of hope and healing, of trust and transformation, of two broken people becoming whole together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Coleman and Caroline walked hand in hand back to their cabin, their home, their sanctuary. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Before them, the warm glow of lamplight spilled from the windows where their family waited. And around them, the love they had built together wrapped them like a blanket, keeping them safe and warm and profoundly grateful for the day a young woman had announced that God sent her to Wallace to find a husband, and a mountain man had recognized himself as the answer to her prayer.